Hi, everybody. It's really such a privilege to join this set of Plastinars. I've been watching them and there's been such fantastic speakers. I feel like really honoured to be joining that list this evening. So, as I was just introduced, I'm Professor Nicola Beaumont and I'm very fortunate to lead the Sea and Society team at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. A first heads up before I get started is my talk was shown as being an ecosystem plastic pollution and ecosystem problem. What I'm actually going to talk to you about is an ecosystem service problem. And before I really get started, therefore, I think it's critical that I explain to you what an ecosystem service is. Apologies for those of you who already know this. So a lot of my research has been undertaken looking at ecosystem services, and an ecosystem service is very simply a benefit that we get from the marine environment. So these benefits could be anything from the fact that the oceans take up our CO2 to the fact that marine habitats provide flood defense and prevent coastal erosion. They provide us with food. They provide us with a place we can go to recreate and to have fun and to relax. So it's an awkward term, the ecosystem service, but really it's very simple in terms of what it means. It just means a benefit which we're getting from the environment. Now, I thought it would be useful if I began by explaining a little bit about my own personal drivers for my work. I did my first degree in marine biology, and it became very clear to me during that time that a lot of the research that was undertaken wasn't translated into policy. So I could see a lot of people in the labs doing their amazing science, and there was a real disconnect with actually making a change with policymakers and managers. So at the end of my degree, I thought, well, I need to retrain, and 21-year-old me decided that the most relevant way to make a difference was if you could talk in terms of money. So I went into what some people might consider the dark side, and I retrained in economics. And I spent the next 10 years really of my research career doing environmental valuation and ecosystem service valuation. So putting monetary values, if you like, on environmental resources, but most importantly, putting monetary values on changes in environmental resources. What I spent a lot of time doing was working with policymakers, and I've been very fortunate to inform quite a lot of policy documents. I think the key reason why I made this shift is because I felt like a lot of the science that was undertaken is undertaken, it's shared, and people go, well, that's great, it's really interesting, but like, so what? Like, why should I care? You know, they might have that momentary interest and then put a paper down or move on or think about something else. And I think particularly I notice this in politicians when they're trying to balance the budgets and they're looking at an education budget and a health budget and an environment budget. And you're trying to say to them, look, this environmental issue is really important. But when they're trying to balance that against education and health, they're like, well, so what? So what? Why should we care? Now, I know we here in this room, if you like, we understand so what and how important environment is and how it is influential to our health and our education. But a lot of other people aren't. So my work has been really taking this so what approach. So when we do research, we go, well, so what, who cares? And I'm really keen on answering that question. Over the years, I've moved a little bit away from economics. I still do valuation, but I'm very keen on interdisciplinary working. And now I work with pretty much every discipline you can think of, from artists to psychologists, to geographers, to historians. And I'm much, much broader in my approach, but I keep that same at my core. So what? Why should we care? And I've applied that thinking to a whole range of areas, to blue carbon, to flood defenses, using the natural capital approach, looking at renewable energies. But most recently, I've been applying my so what to marine plastic pollution. And I think it's really, that previous talk by Anna was absolutely fantastic. And it was so interesting. But what was also interesting was a lot of the comments that I was seeing down at the bottom in the questions at the end. And I think what we see a lot of is that we know about the sources of plastics now. We know a lot about where the plastic is coming from. We know a lot about the distribution. You know, we see that it's everywhere. We know it's on the mountains. We know it's at the bottom of the sea. We know it's in our bodies. And we know a lot about the ecological impacts. We're all quite used to seeing now pictures of seagulls with their bellies full of plastic, or pictures of nests which are made predominantly full of plastic. And again, for those of us here in this room, that's probably enough to make us think, oh, okay, we need to take action, we need to do something. But for a lot of other people outside of this room, it might be enough to trigger in them that they feel they want to take action in that moment. But it's not always enough for them to want to take action 5 minutes later. They might have read that paper and thought, how hideous, and then gone out and bought a sandwich pre-packaged in plastic and just loved the plastic wrapper. I think in one of the very early talks, Sabine Pahl gave an excellent presentation about people's behaviour and the fact that you can educate people as much as you like, but you need to have a much broader understanding of the person and the person's behaviour and the context of the person before you can really influence what the person does. And I hope I see some of the research that I've been doing as helping to fill in that puzzle and providing an extra so what. So when people say, okay, there's another dolphin and it's another image with more plastic, and then they move on so quickly, people, you know, and we see all of this in the media, but yet still we see commerce and industry producing vast amounts of plastic. We see poor waste disposal strategies. We see governments not moving fast enough to tackle this. Still people are saying, well, it's dreadful, but actually, so what? And I'm quite busy and I've got this meeting to get to, or I'm quite busy and I've got this, that, the other to do. So I think what I'm aiming to do really in my research is to provide a so what. Why should we care? And how I do this, or how I've done this recently, is by taking what we call an ecosystem service approach, where we translate these ecological impacts into ecosystem service impacts, and then we translate them into economic impacts. So we say, okay, we're seeing these changes in the ecology, but what does that mean for the ecosystem services? What does that mean for the benefits that we are receiving as humans on land? And what does that mean for costs? How much is it going to cost us? And the idea of this is hopefully working with psychologists, working with the ecologists. I'm not saying that monetary valuation and ecosystem services is the only route, but hopefully using this whole suite of ways of communication will be able to provide the information required to shift these legislative drivers, these industrial drivers, and these human behavior drivers. So this is what I'm trying to do. It's the same so what approach as I've been using for 25 years. And I'll talk you through a little bit about how I've been doing this. So one of the first things to be aware of is how little literature there has been undertaken on the social and economic aspects of plastic. So most of the work has been done very much in the ecological sphere, with only very few studies. This was a literature review that we did on 1,100 different studies. And you can see out of those 1,100 different studies that there was barely 50 on social and economic aspects. And again, I know Sabine in the very first presentation she did raised a very similar thing. So there's very little work being done on this. It's increasing, but slowly. So the start of my so what journey was in the Arctic, where I worked on a project called Mark III. And this is when I first started to really engage in the plastic discussion. The idea of this was to really start to understand what the costs of the plastic pollution in the Arctic were. And we did a really techie economic study, which I've shown here, to look at what the values were. And I'm not going to talk about that today because there isn't time to do everything, but I just wanted to make you aware of this sort of economics work that was going on. What I want to talk to you about today is the ecosystem services approach that we used in the Arctic. And this wasn't just me, this was a team of people. So what did we do? Well, we started out by saying, okay, what are the ecosystem services that come from the Arctic marine environment. And so the question is, what are the benefits that we're getting from the Arctic? What are the benefits that humans get from the Arctic? And we sort of went through these, we worked with some local communities, and we spent quite a lot of time talking to people about what these were. I'm just giving you a very brief overview now. So the key benefits that we had were wild animals for food, raw materials. This very beautiful picture on the right-hand side is actually a reindeer hide that's sewn with a needle made from whalebone. And obviously here we've got down as well. Other benefits which we get from the Arctic are an equitable climate. So the Arctic plays a really fundamental role in maintaining the global climate. We get clean air and we get improved water quality. We get a whole host of different cultural benefits from the Arctic, such as recreation and tourism. We get aesthetic benefits, education, entertainment. There's huge religious and spiritual cultural benefits associated with the Arctic. And there's something called bequest and existence value associated with the Arctic. And these values are very specific. These are benefits that we get, even if we've never been to the Arctic, even if we're never going to go to the Arctic, we take pleasure from the fact that it's there. A really good example of this is a polar bear. I think most of us here, if we were told that actually polar bears were extinct now, they will never walk again, that's the end of polar bears, we'd feel really quite distressed by that. And this is the fact that we value their existence. We're not actually getting any active benefit from them, but we just value the fact that they're there. So these are all of the different benefits that we get from the Arctic. Then the second thing we did is we looked at what the ecological impacts of plastic were in the Arctic. So what was the issue with plastic and how was it affecting the ecology? And pretty much all the papers at the time, this was probably 2018, so 2 and a bit years ago, pretty much all the papers were focused on bird ingestion. And a whole host of different Arctic birds. And when we undertook the review, we saw that the majority of the birds had plastic in their stomachs. Most of them had some degree of plastic ingested. We looked into it more deeply to try and understand whether or not this was having an effect on mortality, or an effect on their mortality or on their life expectancy. And in a lot of cases, we found that it was definitely influencing the life expectancy of the birds, and particularly the reproduction, their capacity for reproduction. So this was the same thing as I've said to you earlier. It's like, okay, we've got this fairly awful data, really quite distressing data. But again, in this room, we could say, you know, immediately people would probably want to take action based on this. Outside of this room, it might have an impact for a while until somebody perhaps we worry about Donald Trump, or maybe, I don't know, finds out that their child has just failed their exams at school, and then their attention moves on. So what we wanted to do here was go a little bit further with this and say, well, so what? Like, why should we care? Why should you care? Why should you humans sat there on your sofa, why should you care about this? So we married this up, we paired this up with the work that we did just that I showed you previously. And we looked at the ecosystem services of the Arctic, and we did a review to understand how that impacts on the birds would affect the ecosystem services. And we found that there was a link with the contamination of the food chain, both through potentially the eggs of the birds, but also through some traditional dishes, such as this dish here, where they stuff a seal with lots of tiny orcs, and then they leave it for a long time while it degrades, and then while it decomposes, and then they eat that. But they're eating the whole bird, so they're eating all the plastic and all the toxins associated with the plastics. So there's this risk of contamination of food chain. The second thing is there's impaired recreational opportunities associated with this. If we've got fewer birds, then less recreational opportunities, and also birds in distress or nests that are heavily polluted with plastic. We have a loss of charismatic species, so potentially a decline in these birds. And I think probably one of the most interesting things is actually when we looked more generally, obviously, again, no surprise to a lot of people here, the birds are so fundamental to the food chain in the Arctic. The food chains are quite small up there, quite short, that any impact on them was likely to have an impact across the board. So affecting the entire Arctic ecosystem as an effect. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to sort of say, okay, we're seeing these impacts on the birds, but look what this means more generally, look what this means for humans. So we did this work, and this is being written up at the moment, but it set me thinking, okay, well, that's Arctic and that's birds, and that's interesting, but what about if we did this on a global basis? So then we set about actually doing the similar thing, but on a global basis. And instead of just looking at birds, looking at all marine species. And this is the paper that we produced on this. So we did this huge literature review. And like I said, it was interesting because a lot of the papers were on ingestion, a lot on entanglement, a lot on rafting. Most of the papers were on birds, fish, mammals, turtles, and some on invertebrates. So that was quite interesting itself to see the bias of the literature. And a lot of papers on the abundance of plastic. What was fascinating, I mean, there's quite a lot of papers out there that just report that people have seen 4 pieces of plastic in this place or 5 pieces of plastic in that place. A remarkable thing was the lack of that there was no systematic agenda to how a lot of this data was calculated. Lots of authors approached this in very different ways, used very different methods, reported their data in very different ways. So it was very difficult to then systematize this because all the data was reported very differently. So we looked at this as a team of experts, and all of the different species groups that I've already said, so this time moving beyond just birds and looking across a whole set of different species and animals. And what this figure shows is that we were seeing negative impacts. So this was a negative impact on the frequency of the animal, the spatial extent of the animal, and the reversibility. And we've also assessed how reversible the effect was. And you can see for the majority of the species groups here, we were seeing pretty dramatic negative effects. And what's also quite interesting is that the shade of the blue shows you how confident we were in this. And for a lot of these, we had good confidence that these were negative impacts. The only ones that were not were bacteria and algae. And this is because the plastics provide a really nice place for bacteria and algae to live. So in a soft bottomed estuary, for example, where you don't have any rock and there's nowhere for the bacteria and algae to settle, if you've got plastic in there, it provides a new habitat for it to stay. Now, this isn't always good news, because if you have got, for example, bacteria settling on plastic, and the bacteria and the plastic has come down from a sewage treatment works, it's come down an estuary, has picked up bacteria, washes up on the beach, then you've got heavily contaminated plastic. So great for the bacteria and great for the algae, not always so great for humans. So this is an overview of some of the ecosystem effects. Then the same as we did in the Arctic, we wanted to know, well, okay, well, what are the ecosystem service effects? So bear with me with this figure. I think it's easiest if we start by looking at the birds, as we did previously. So down here on the x-axis, you can see birds entanglement and birds ingestion. And if you follow that up on the y-axis, on the vertical side, you can see the different ecosystem services listed. So for birds, you can see that they get a negative impact for wild food, a negative impact for fibers, and negative impact for materials. So this is the fact that the birds provide feathers and the birds provide food. So we're seeing a negative impact for the ecosystem services that the birds provide. That was how we did it for the Arctic. Now in this study, we've done it for all animals and across the world. So for example, if you take fish, we're seeing a negative impact for food, but also for aquaculture, and also for fibers that they might produce, and also for plant and animal and genetic materials. We're seeing a negative impact for all of these ecosystem services that the fish provide. We did this same analysis for all the different types of ecosystem services. So that first block is showing you the provisioning services. So they're the benefits that we get there, where we like food and aquaculture, where we're taking things from the marine environment. The middle box is about the regulatory services. So they're the benefits we get from the fact that the marine environment regulates our climate. It protects us from flood and erosion, and it takes up our waste and processes them. And the final box here is cultural services. So these are the benefits we get by going down to the oceans and experiencing it, being in it, or watching it on the television, or like I said earlier about existence values, the fact that we like the fact that it's there. So hopefully this shows you that for the majority of the species groups, we're seeing really, really fundamental negative impacts on the benefits which we get from the ocean. So although all of those impacts are happening in the sea, us on land, we're feeling them. Like, they're affecting us. It's affecting the way the oceans regulate our climate. It's affecting our food. It's affecting our recreational opportunities. Everybody, not just on the coast, across the board, we're being affected. This is why so what? This is why you should start to care. So this is just the start of the story. In the middle box here, there's a lot of grey, and that's because we don't know. So the pale grey means unknown. So there's a lot more work to be done here. It doesn't mean there's no effect. So we did this and we thought, okay, this is progress. This is sort of starting a nice story about why so what. And we got from this, similar to the birds, the main things that were affected were the fishing, this potential contamination of human food, loss of charismatic species, and impaired recreational opportunities, which is great. But we wanted to go the next step. We wanted to know, well, that's fine, but what does that mean in terms of actual cost? And we wanted to see if we could calculate a social cost of marine plastic. Now, those of you who've been engaged in the climate debate will know that one of the key tools that's been used is they've worked out a cost per ton of carbon. So you might have heard of a carbon tax or carbon price. And having that cost for every ton of carbon that is released has really shifted how regulation is undertaken, how carbon can be taxed, and basically the whole way that the carbon system is managed. We wanted to know if we could do something similar for plastic. So we did a sort of ballpark calculation. In all honesty, this is not something that you want to there's definite cause for uncertainty in this, but the idea was that we'd start a dialogue. So we know that from a previous study that all of those benefits that we get from the marine environment that I spoke about earlier, they in a previous study have been calculated to provide us with 50 trillion per year across the world. Using the evidence that we had on the previous chart and the experts that we know, we estimated that we were actually seeing between a 1% and 5% decline in marine ecosystem services as a result of plastic. So combining this with the 50 trillion, this means we're looking at an annual loss every year of between 500 to 2,500 billion. This is annual, this is every year. But these big numbers, I mean, they're great for headlines, but they're not so great when you're actually trying to think these things through in your head. I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I can't really imagine what 500 billion is. So we wanted to put it in a slightly different term, and we translated this into cost per ton of plastic. And we used the Jambeck figure about how much plastic there is in the ocean and calculated this way. And we worked out that every ton of marine plastic pollution is probably having an impact of about between 3 and 33,000. This will be an underestimate. And like I said, it's a real ballpark estimate, but it was to start this dialogue and start to say, well, so what? Why should I care? Well, this is why I should care. This is why this issue should be taking a platform alongside education and alongside health. This is why your government should be making a change. This is why industry should be starting to pay their way when it comes to this issue. And the paper got quite a nice media uptake. So it was really interesting, Anna's presentation earlier. I'd like to talk some more about that because some of the media uptake was spot on and some was quite interesting how it was interpreted. But what is more interesting, in honesty to me, is the fact that now it's been taken up in policy. So I think the media thing is always interesting. I've had other experiences on other topics where I've been in the media spotlight for a while, and it moves on. Like 2 days later, they're reporting something else. The really satisfying thing as an academic is when you start to see it appearing in policy, and now it's got 2 or 3 policy references already. So it's starting to, really start this dialogue. Some really quick limitations. It's an underestimate. It varies massively. The social cost will vary hugely depending on where the plastic is emitted and where it is. It will change in the future. It's not set. And it's interesting because this is, very broad plastic. We didn't break it down into different plastic life stages. So in wrapping up, 3 core recommendations. My first, I think, would be that we need a systematic global research agenda. One of the really obvious things about this was when I was trying to create my so what story, the evidence was such a mess. Like, reported in every different way, in every different possible format, and it was really unhelpful. So I think this is a really key starting point. The second thing is that I do believe this social cost could be really helpful to help us shape future national and global negotiations, potentially in being used as a tax, potentially being used, I saw somebody in the questions earlier mentioned offsets, could potentially be used to inform an offset debate. Having these monetary values can be really helpful, not just to raise awareness, but also in targeting policy and management. And finally, as I said at the beginning, so I trained in economics, and there is a lot of other economic research that's now been done on plastics. I know there was a fantastic Plastinar last week on economics of plastic. I guess what I would say is, although this is one method, I think what's really important is we use a whole host of different methods. So we need the psychologists, we need the artists, we need all the different disciplines to be working together to tackle this issue. And finally, as a message, I think that what's important is we can sell this story as a win, that if we reduce marine plastic, we'll be investing for our future, and we'll actually see huge benefits in the future if we do this. So rather than all the negative information all the time, I was trying to sell this story as a win. Invest now and we'll have huge benefits in the future. So that was all. Thank you so much for your time.